Hello everybody and welcome back to another tutorial. This tutorial is a continuation of our How to Make Clothing mini-series that I have been doing. We've been making a robe, like nightgown kind of robe, that is going to be a Nitro asset for my Discord server. And in the last few tutorials, we've talked about how to actually make your clothing, as well as how to go through and do a high poly sculpt and do the UV mapping for it to get it prepared for texturing. And today is finally the day that we will be moving on to how to texture your clothing. So if you're not too sure how to prepare your UV maps for texturing, definitely check out the tutorial right before this one. We covered that in the last half of the tutorial, and then today we will be solely focusing on texturing. So we are primarily going to be working in Substance Painter. I know that there are other programs to texture 3D assets. Unfortunately, I'm not really familiar with any other program other than Substance Painter. And something I had mentioned in the last tutorial is, from what I understand of texturing assets and UV mapping, the process for preparing your UV map to texture shouldn't be really any different if you're using a different program. But please keep in mind that different programs might have different requirements on how to texture. So I can't really answer any questions on those, but if you do need to know how to UV map in general, then that is included in the last tutorial, and that today is solely focused in Substance Painter to start getting the asset textured. By the end of this tutorial, we will have it fully textured. I do want to put out a little disclaimer that I kind of mentioned in the last video as well. I have tried to go through and redo this Substance Painter tutorial quite a few times, but there is just so much that can be done in Substance Painter, and so many different methods and ways that things can be done, and little tips and tricks and tools that I am still learning countless new things as I go. So I'm going to link in the description down below a YouTube channel that I have used primarily to learn Substance Painter. There are tons of other tutorials and channels out there that are dedicated to Substance Painter and can break down everything probably much better than I can. So I want to just point that out in the description below. The channel that I use to learn, they do go really fast. So I definitely recommend that if you need to, just remember that you can change the playback speed. That's what I did on some of their videos, to slow everything down and learn it. So I will do my best today to kind of give you guys like a basic overview of Substance Painter. Just know that, like I said, there's a ton of things that you can do, and I'm normally very open to answering questions, but when it comes to Substance Painter, of course I'll do my best to answer any questions that you guys have. Just please be understanding that I might not be able to answer everything, because there is so much that can be done and so much that I am still learning. So today I'm going to try to keep it as basic as I can, just with the basic texturing, basic baking, and we're also going to be doing alphas because I want this robe to have some lace on it, so that is something that we will cover as well. One other little disclaimer is, I know that it is possible to bake in Blender. Unfortunately, I don't really know how to bake in Blender. I am sorry for those of you that maybe don't have Substance Painter and wanted to learn how to bake in Blender. It's not something I am very familiar with, but I do know that is an option. So if that's something that you would want to research on your own, definitely recommend it. I know a lot of creators that don't have Substance Painter, maybe do their texturing in Procreate or something, will use Blender to bake, but unfortunately I don't know really how to do that, and I do my baking in Substance Painter. So yeah, just kind of wanted to throw out a few different little disclaimers for today's video, just because I know not everyone uses Substance Painter, and just that I've gotten requested quite a few times to do a tutorial on it. So today is going to be kind of like a basic one, kind of my typical workflow in Substance Painter. I, in the future, would like to look at doing a more in-depth Substance Painter tutorial, or different little things that I do know of in Substance Painter, but right now I am focusing on redoing most of my older videos and adding to them and expanding them. So if I do a future Substance Painter tutorial, I will definitely try to go a little bit more in depth, but I'm going to try to keep this one basic while also like being enough information to kind of get you guys started. And I hope that works out well for everyone. So I apologize if this is too long or too short, and I'm sorry that I'm rambling. There is a lot to cover, and like I said, I've tried to redo this a few times, so my brain's just already going 90 to nothing with everything there is to do. So with that being said, let's go ahead and just jump straight into it. All right, so we are back in Blender right now. Just to kind of pick up where we last left off from our robe. We have our robe here, and we do have our high poly version. I don't think that I got the chance to do it on screen last time, but I forgot that I needed to go through and texture up or sculpt in the bow. So I just went through today before I hit record and just threw on some very, very quick folds. I didn't really spend too much time on that. So again, nothing new from what we did in the last video, but other than that, we're just right back where we left off. Everything has been UV unwrapped for our low poly robe. So I just wanted to cover, just in case, I know this is covered in a lot of my other tutorials, but just in case you guys haven't seen any of that, I wanted to cover how to export. So we need to export both our low poly and our high poly versions, and we need to keep them separate. So we're going to go to File, Export, FBX, and go to wherever you need to save your file. Okay, so I have navigated over to where I want to save this asset, and you can title it whatever you need to. If you need to name it something different, I'm just going to title it LP Robe for low poly. And something you want to do is over here on this side, you want to hit, if this isn't extended down, make sure to extend down where it says include, and limit to selected objects. That way it's only going to export your low poly robe in case you have anything else in your project like I do. But also if you only have the low poly and high poly versions in your project, like I said, you want to make sure to export those separately. So that's super duper important to make sure that you have your low poly version selected, and you click limit to selected objects and you hit export FBX, and it's going to take its second to export that out. And then once it is finished, we're going to do the exact same thing, but this time I'm selecting the low poly robe. I'm going to hit export FBX and rename this one to high poly robe, and it's still limited to selected objects. We're going to hit export again. So that's all that we're going to be doing in Blender today. Like I said, this video is primarily focused on texturing, so then the next tutorial after this will be the final tutorial of this like mini clothing series, where we will rig the robe and do some data transfers, as well as rig up the sleeves and the bottom so that those can have their own fizz bones, but then I'll show you guys how to get the rest of it weighted to the body just right. Okay, now that it is done exporting, I'm going to go ahead and save my Blender file, and I'm going to close and move over to our Substance Painter. So now that that is exported, and we can open up our Substance Painter. I currently am running it through Steam. I bought Substance Painter through Steam. I am not sure, as far as I'm aware of, the layout won't be any different. I think as far as like some of these like default things, you guys, if y'all bought it through Adobe directly, I think it comes with more stuff, and it might come with more brushes, I believe, and more smart materials. Like I think if you buy it directly through Adobe, it comes with like extra stuff in terms of like pre-made like brushes and materials and stuff. But I just wanted to throw that out there, that I am using the Steam edition just in case you guys see extra stuff that I don't have. But it's a lot like using a different Blender version. The process is going to be the same whether you have extra, materials or not. So this is what Substance Painter will look like whenever you first launch it. And it looks like there's a lot going on, but I promise once you kind of get like the basics down of it, it's really not all that overwhelming. So to start like your own project, you need to come up to the left-hand corner, click File, and you're going to do New. It's going to open this little project here, and I think the default template is like one of these ASM ones, but if you just extend that down, there's one in here called Blender Starter Assets. I'm going to put another disclaimer out there. I am not sure if any other VRChat asset creators are going to be watching this and say I'm completely doing it wrong. I've never gotten my textures to work very well when I used a different template. Y'all are more than welcome to play around with other templates. I honestly don't really know what all the difference is that it makes. The workflow is the same, but I feel like I've always had issues whenever I've tried to export stuff from other templates versus exporting it from this Blender template. So that's just a lot of this Substance Painter tutorial is just going to be how I personally do things, just like all of my other tutorials, but I just want to toss it out there. Feel free to like play around with other settings and watch multiple tutorials and kind of see which workflow works best for you. But this is how I personally start all my stuff. I always use the Blender template. Like I said, you can mess with these other like ASM PBR templates. The PBR is basically like, if I'm understanding it correctly, it's like fancy shading and shader stuff, kind of like how Poyomi for VRChat avatars is like a fancier shader than the default VRChat stuff. But like I said, I've never really messed around with multiple ones, and whenever I have tried to like use different like there's like Roblox ones and like Unreal Engine, that's all for like different types of games. So I definitely recommend just sticking to the Blender one, since we know that is what VRChat uses and functions with. But yeah, you're welcome to play with other ones. I go through on my document resolution, I normally bump it up to 2K. Again, you can keep it lower if you want to. I suggest and recommend keeping your main textures around the 2K spot. You can up it to 4K if you want, but it's just going to help things come out really clear and not super low and pixelated. And you can always lower your image resolution if you need to, for optimizing your avatars and stuff. But if you are going in with the intent of making an optimized texture for like an optimized avatar, then they have those different resolutions already in here for you. I normally bump mine up to 2K just so that it is crisp and clear without being overly like I want to say high poly, but that's not the word, but it's not as high as like 4K. I would not recommend messing with any of this stuff here. The UV tile settings is kind of like an advanced thing of Substance Painter. If you've already done your UV mappings, you don't need to worry about that. And you also don't need to worry about this import settings. Import cameras, we don't need. Auto unwrap is really helpful if you don't know how to unwrap your own projects. I don't recommend relying on it though, because it's not going to be as like clean as if you were to unwrap it yourself, and sometimes it can also cause like stretching and like your texture will stretch kind of funny and your map just kind of looks weird, which if people are wanting to go through and like edit your textures to like maybe have their logo on it or something, it can cause that to warp really funny. So I wouldn't recommend relying on it, but if you just want to get in and just start playing around with Substance Painter without really worrying about your UV mapping, or if maybe you've tried it and you're not really comfortable with it yet, that option is there. And of course they have other options that you can mess around with like the seams and margins and all kinds of fun stuff that you can mess around with there that I'm not really going to get into, because again, not really important if we are following the tutorial where we have already undone our UV maps. So that's really all I do whenever I hit new project. We change it to the Blender template and the document resolution to 2K, and then that's it. I will say, just as a little warning, there have been a few times that I think I've come through and used auto unwrap, and then the next time I booted up Substance Painter, it was still check marked. So do be cautious of that, because there is one time that I was going to completely retexture one of Zenpia's bases for a furry avatar that I was working on, and it had this check marked and I didn't realize it, so I completely textured it, spent hours texturing this base. But whenever I went to go export the textures, since I did auto unwrap, it no longer matched the UV map that the base came with, so the texture was completely useless. So whenever we go to wrap up this part of the tutorial, I will show you how to export out your new FBX from Substance Painter if you do auto unwrap it, because you'll need to do that. Just know that if it's something that was rigged like a base, So like I said, I had tried to texture a base, and since it had that checked and I didn't realize it, the UV map was different. So that meant if I exported it now out of Substance Painter and put it into Blender, it would no longer have armature, blend shapes, visemes, anything. So it was pretty much completely useless. So whenever you export something out of Substance Painter as an FBX from using the auto unwrap, just know it will not keep anything like that. So that's only best if you're doing something like this, like you're making an asset from scratch and you haven't rigged it, you haven't put on any blend shapes or anything like that. Then you can go ahead and export it if you need to. I just kind of wanted to put out like a little moment to talk about the auto unwrap because it is super helpful, but it can also damage you in your progress in the sense of if you're trying to do something that already has the blend shapes and the armature and all that kind of stuff, and then you auto unwrap it, your texturing is now useless, and your mesh is now useless because it doesn't have anything that you would need it to function. So, okay, sorry for the cut there. I got super confused for a moment. I was like, why isn't my button like letting me continue? It's because I got too sidetracked talking about the auto unwrap and everything else that I forgot to tell you guys how to import your file. So up here where it says file, hit select. It's going to open up your like Windows Explorer. Just navigate over to where you had saved your FBX, and we will select that to import. So I've selected my low poly rope that I had exported from Blender just a few moments ago. So we're going to hit open and it'll pop up right here. And then the OK button will pop up and you click that. And ta-da, now it is imported. I do not think that my layout is any different from the default Substance Painter layout, but it might be. I think maybe it like defaults like this one's more wide, but it works a lot like Blender. Like you can just kind of grab like the different windows and like drag them around and make them bigger or smaller if you need to. You can also grab like this like layers thing, this texture set list, like you can grab and hold it and drag it to like rearrange things. So I think, actually, now that I think about it, I think the default Substance Painter might have this down here at the bottom. But yeah, just know that you can like drag around your windows to like organize it however you want to. I will do my best to say like what area that we're selecting stuff so that you guys know where to go if you do need to rearrange your stuff. Or if you want to make it layout like mine or leave it as the default, whatever is best for you. So, I don't know why it says that, so let's change the title to Rope Texture. So this is going to be the name that you're up here in the corner under texture set list. This is going to be the name that your textures have. So if you have ever gotten a texture that's like Jeans Saturation 1, Jeans Pattern 2, etc., they changed that up here. So do keep that in mind. Especially if you're wanting to sell your asset commercially, you might want to rechange it just so that it's a little bit easier for people to know what's going on. So before we get into like actually baking, I do want to talk about navigating Substance Painter because it's a little bit different from Blender and Unity. They all function different. I'm sorry, it's so frustrating. So you have to hold Alt and click with your left mouse, and you can swirl around your project like this. And then if you still hold Alt and hold down your middle mouse, you can pan it like this. And then with your right mouse key, also holding Alt, you can zoom in and out. So yeah, it navigates a little bit different than Blender and Unity, but just remember that Alt is how you navigate, and then you'll use your mouse keys accordingly. So, and of course, middle mouse to scroll in and out. Yeah. So anyways, that being said, we will get into everything that you see on the screen in a minute. Like I said, I'm going to try to keep this basic while also being enough to help you guys know pretty much my own workflow for assets so that you guys have enough information to start texturing your own assets. And then from there, whether it's from a future tutorial of mine or a different channels, you can, start playing around with looking into some of the more advanced stuff in Substance Painter. So I'm just going to kind of go in order of how I do my assets. So from this page, I just import my project. The first thing that I normally do is I head over here to the side where there's this like beach ball. There's this like paper, computer, beach ball, a clock, all these little symbols. If you click on the ball, it says shader settings. And if you come up here, it says ASM metal rough. You don't have to do this. You don't have to do this unless you are planning on making transparent textures. I am wanting to put lace on the edges of our robe, so I'm going to click this and change it to this one, which says PBR metal rough with alpha blending. And there's also another like alpha one that you can select. It's just going to make your alpha like a little bit more, I want to say like soft versus like hard edges, I guess is the best way to put it. You can leave all of this stuff as is. You don't really have to mess with any of that. And I believe it's here. Okay, sorry. So I had to change to the original setting to find it. So if you aren't using alpha, if you noticed on the alpha ones, once I selected it, the back of the asset started to show up. If you want that, but you're not using alpha and you're still on like the default ASM metal rough option, it's still under that little like beach ball thing, this shader settings. You can just scroll down a little bit to where it says right here, it's kind of hard to see, so it's geometry, this parallax thing, but right here under bent normal it says double-sided. You can check mark that and it'll make your asset like show everything. It's a lot like if you're familiar with Quest avatars and faces and normals and all that. That's basically what it is it's just, this is the front face and technically the inside of the robe is the back face, so it just wasn't rendering that. So if you want it to, you can just come in and check mark double-sided, and it'll pop it up for you. I'm going to change back to my alpha shading since that's what I'm going to need. So now that we have, you know, kind of it set, and you don't have to do that right away. I just prefer to do it so I don't forget about it later. But that's really only if you want it to show double-sided or if you're using alphas. But from there, I head up to this top corner where it shows this little like croissant. That's going to be our baking settings. And they put the little, in my opinion, the little croissant there helps you remember that that is the baking tab. So here we can see our asset with its wireframe. The double-sided thing isn't going to show up in this window, but that's okay. You don't really need it. I normally come over here to where it says mesh map settings, and I normally change it to 4K for the output size. I don't know if this is correct or not, but to me, I feel like whenever I make the baking output size higher, it lets the bake, like, I don't know, it lets it bake a little bit more at a higher resolution. So I prefer to bump it up to the 4K just so that the shadows are a little bit crisper. Totally up to you if you want to leave that or not. I would recommend, you know, as you get more comfortable with texturing, to kind of go through and start learning a little bit more about some of this stuff over here, your normal, ambient occlusion, your position, thickness, height, opacity, all that kind of stuff. But for just a basic asset, you don't really need to worry about any of that. That's just the maps that it's going to generate. And you can do some really, really cool stuff, especially with like the ambient occlusion and the normals. But for right now, like I said, I wouldn't really worry about that too much. You can just leave all of that as it is defaulted. So to import, we're going to want to import our high poly, because that's what we're trying to do, is we're going to basically send a light through the high poly version onto this low poly version so that it kind of prints all of those folds and all of that sculpting that we did onto this low poly version right here. So as you can see right now, it's really flat, and by the time that we're done, it will look a lot like the high poly version that we sculpted, but it will still have the same wireframe as the low poly version. And if you want to turn off the wireframe, it's just up here, this baking visualization, just hit that eyeball and it'll hide the wireframe for you so you can see a little bit better. So to import our high poly robe, over here back under the mesh map settings, you're going to go where it says high poly parameters, high definition meshes, and there's this little paper button. You're going to click that and it's going to open back up your Windows Explorer. And if it doesn't default you to where you saved your stuff, just head back over to where it's saved, click on your high poly thing and click open. And that's it. You can again play around with all of this if you want to. but I normally leave it just as is. I'm going to turn on the wireframe so that you guys can actually see what we're doing. So if you leave it off before you bake, like you just import your high poly and leave off the wireframe, I would definitely recommend go ahead and turning it back on so that you can see what is going on, because this is super duper important. So the best way I can put this is, you see this kind of like, it's that same color, kind of that like off-white-ish color. That is our low poly mesh. And the blue is our high poly mesh. And then the red is where they are kind of like overlapping, I guess is the best way to put it, but not in the way that they're supposed to. So this like wireframe outline here is kind of like the circumference, I guess, like the diameter of our high poly mesh compared to our low poly. So we want that red to go away, because anywhere that there is red, it's going to mess up your bake to absolutely no end. It's going to come through all kinds of like triangles, and like the shading is going to look funny, and it's going to be like, it's just not going to look right. So you actually want to get as little bit of red as possible. Now here on the inside, like at this angle, if you see like right here, like we can see red, now we can't. That's understandable because the wireframe isn't touching it. So like that's normal, because that's just where the edge are. But all these like really big folds that I have here, I want to get rid of. So there's two ways that you can do this. I can go back into Blender and kind of remember where those spots are, and I can try to sculpt those down, which sometimes I do have to do because sometimes it's just so far out away from the low poly version that whenever I go to bake it, those really big folds might bake really nice, but all the smaller folds won't really show up because it's too far away. So sometimes that is something that we have to do. But what you can currently do to kind of test if that's something you need to go back into Blender for or not is back over here where we imported our high poly mesh. It says max frontal distance and max rear distance. I normally only mess with the frontal distance. The rear distance I never see do anything. But we can just scroll this up until that red is gone. But now there's still some red down here. So I might go back in Blender and kind of get rid of that, because the wireframe is already pretty far away from our low poly mesh. And if I take it all the way out there, it's super duper far. So I'm going to go ahead and bake it and we'll see. But if you don't like it, just remember you can always go back into Blender and, you know, fix up your sculpt and then come back into Substance Painter if you need to. There is a way up here under edit. It says project configuration and re-import mesh. You can use either one of those to re-import if you make any changes in Blender. As long as you export it with the same name and it's the same mesh, you can hit re-import mesh and it'll automatically redo it. But since we changed, remember on the front page that we had changed the texture name, then that option won't work, because it's going to, how like Blender registers things as FBX names, Substance registers things as texture names. So since we imported it with a different texture name, it would have issues. So in Blender, I could just change that texture name to whatever I put it in Substance Painter. But you could also just do project configuration and just re-import it like directly. And that way, you know, you don't have to go through and change your shader settings or your resolutions or anything like that. So it's, you know, super easy, either one of those options to re-import something if you need to go into Blender and make changes. Which, like I said, I might do. It just depends. I'm going to go ahead and bake it first and see what the bake comes out like. But that is pretty far away, and I'm not the most confident that that's going to come out very well, but we shall see, especially with the bow. Like, the bow is concerning me. But yeah, especially, I mean, I did some super big folds on this thing, so you know, that you can kind of see here how it pudges out more. So that's definitely on me, but you know, for normal asset, if you don't have something, you know, massive like that, sometimes you even have to take it down to get it. You want to keep the wireframe as close to the original mesh as possible is the best way to put it. And sometimes, you know, if you're like me, you get a little too excited with the sculpting and we make it a little too big, but that's okay. But the goal is to keep it as close as you can without having any red show. So since we want to go ahead and test this, if I need to go into Blender, then I will. I'm going to turn off the wireframe now that I have it set, now that I know that there's no red showing where there shouldn't be. I'm going to go ahead and hide it so I can see what the bake is going to do. So now come down here to the bottom where this blue button is and it says Bake Selected Textures. And it's going to go through and it's going to do its baking. And we can watch it take place. Okay, so now that our bake is done, this is why I like to hide the wireframe so that I can see the final result. And it's actually not too bad. It's actually not too bad at all. So since this is just a Nitro asset and I'm just kind of using this for tutorial purposes, I'm not going to worry too much about the folds. I think it shows a lot of the sculpting pretty good. It shows everything that I did, and I can always make them a little bit more defined with the texturing. So I'm pretty happy with it. The only thing that's not the best is this bow here. I don't really like the shadow that cast. So I might bake those separately. So I think I'll go ahead and do that, and I'll show you guys how I'm going to do that, just so that way you guys can kind of see in case you ever run into that issue yourself. So I'm going to go ahead and open back up Blender. It might take it a minute to load. Okay, so I've opened my Blender back up, and what I'm going to do is on both the low poly and the high poly versions, I'm just going to take this bow and I'm going to just drag it off to the side. Okay, so I messed up a second ago, so what I think would be easier to make sure that everything stays where it's supposed to be is I'm going to select both of my ropes and tab into edit mode and oops. Just gonna hover over everything and hit L to select it, and then I'm just gonna kind of zoom in so I can make sure I'm getting my low poly version as well. That one grabbed, that one. Alright, so now that everything from my bows is selected, I'm just going to drag it over to the side. My computer's gonna lag out because I'm moving a high poly thing. Oh, goodness gracious, what the? I'm not too sure why it was doing that, so instead I'm just gonna hit P and by selection. Okay, sorry for that cut there. I'm trying my best to avoid showing the base super zoomed in or without her robes on, since it's full Nikki under there, and I don't want to get in trouble with YouTube, but I basically just, so I hit P by selection like I showed you guys, and then I just grabbed both of the bows and moved them off to the side, and I think that this is what we're going to do to kind of help avoid this really weird like shadow that it cast. I don't really care for that too much, so yeah, I think the best way that we're going to do that is go ahead and keeping it off to the side so that whenever it bakes, it's going to bake itself and it won't do that weird like shadow on the actual robe, and then that way we can still bake everything, we can still have it on one texture, but it won't be doing that. So now I'm going to combine both of those and combine both of those. I'm going to get rid of these so that it's the same FBX. And then I'm going to head back into Substance Painter. I'm going to return to painting mode, and I just named it Robe Texture. So that's what we are going to name the material, which all it did was it just registered an old asset. So Robe Texture. Okay, now I can re-export these, and then we will re-import it into Substance Painter so that we can redo our bake a little bit cleaner. Okay, so now that I have it re-exported, I'm back in Substance Painter. Like I said before, all I did was I was on the bake page. I just went down to the bottom and clicked return to painting mode, which is our default window, and you can see that the original asset with its original bake is still here. So since I went through and I named the FBX to be the same and the material to be the same, it should be, if we just hit report mesh, it pops everything back up as it was. But so now you can see, since we hit the re-import mesh and everything, like the names all lined up, the belt is now over here, but you can see that it still has the original like bake on it, which we don't like. We want to redo. So we're going to go back over into our baking mode, which you didn't have to leave this page. You could have just done it from here through the edit button up there, but it's just a preference of mine. So I am going to delete from just hitting the minus button, the high poly there. And we're going to re-import the high poly version there. And we're going to give it its second to load. Okay, so now just kind of making sure that everything is set right where we want it to be. So again, it still might be an issue. I might still have to go through and readjust the folds, even if I think it looks okay, just because of the belt, with how far away the meshes are from each other here on the bow, I think is what is causing some of that baking issue on the bow itself, but it will fix it here on the rope. So that's something that we can look at. And something else I think that's really cool about baking is up here in the top right hand corner, you can actually see what maps it's working on. So if you ever want to learn a little bit more about texturing and baking and different maps, and especially if you're trying to learn more about like realistic lighting and stuff for setting up on your avatars, it tells you exactly what maps it's working on, so you can kind of use that to kind of start learning like what maps do what and how they look. Okay, so now that it's done, let's take a look back. That weird cast on the robe is gone. The rest of it looks fine. And if we come over to the bow, actually the bow didn't do it there. It's gonna do it back here, but that's understandable because that's mesh overlapping each other. That's kind of unavoidable, but I'm not too worried about that because that's not really behind the bow, is not really what anyone's going to be seeing quite as much. So I'm not too worried about that. The rest of it looks good. So now we can actually move on to our texturing. So going back to our painting mode, there is so much that can be done when it comes to texturing. One of them is these default materials that Substance Painter gives you. You know, you have like your fabric denim, fabric lace, kind of sort of lace looking felt. You have your cotton jersey, nylon. These are really cool. You could definitely use these. So if we like throw on the denim, you know, it adds the denim texture to it, but it doesn't quite look how we want it to. So I would definitely recommend playing around with these. You can always come over here with your settings, and honestly, to this day, I still just kind of play around with stuff, but you can change the colors, you can change the roughness, which is more of like, how shiny do you want it to be? Something that I definitely want to point out to you guys is this tilling option. This is how you can make it like, right? So if we till it in, now it looks a little bit more accurate, but it's still pretty flat. Right, so that's the only thing about these materials is like they'll do something like that for you, but it has the extra maps attached to it, but it's almost like I don't know, like I can't really access the height channel because that's applied through like all that stuff. I don't know, like I just don't really use these materials a whole ton, but they are super helpful, especially as you start learning more about how to control and like stack things on top of each other. You know, I definitely would use these and then maybe stack them on with some extra like manual adjustments to kind of get it to not be so flat, or maybe add some shading. I personally don't use the just base materials, which is what these are. I come over to this next tab, which is Smart Materials. I swear by Smart Materials. Something else is on, I think if you just like search Substance Painter like community assets. I'll see if I can find a link. If I can find it, I'll put it in the description for you guys. But there's community assets, and I know ArtStation sometimes has free ones. Sometimes they're paid, and I have bought a few my own. You can see some here. But people will go through and make smart materials for you guys, and then you can, like I said, some are free to download, some are paid for, but you can import them. And these ones kind of have everything set up for you. Let me see, what would be a good one? One of my favorites, I think I'm just going to default to, is this fabric burlap. I like this one a lot because, see, it has all my little folders over here. It has everything sectioned out for me. So I have my height details, which again, you can't super duper duper see, but all these little tiny things kind of stack up to equal this look. I have my edges, which you can see it's kind of doing like the colors. So what that's saying is kind of like the edge of the mesh. So like, since this pops out more, it's literally like the highlights of your shadows. If you think about like drawing, right? If you think about like drawing a character, you have your shadows and your highlights. That's kind of what that is. You have your surface details, your pattern, your base color. So if you go through and hide all of that, it goes away. So it's just so cool because like, if I really like the like fabric look of this one, but I want the pattern of, let's see, my checkered one, then I could go through and I can add this one on. If I drag that below and maybe change this like multiply. See, so now I have that fabric pattern from the burlap one, which, let me just, hold on. Right. So if I have my like, you know, my checkered thing here, I don't know. I feel like this isn't like a very good example, but like I like smart materials because you can, everything is sectioned out for you, and it's a little bit easier for you to just go through and like play with the different settings and hide some things, keep some things, and stack different, you know, settings to be able to get a more customized texture. I know I'm not like really explaining everything right now. I just wanted to kind of show you guys why I absolutely swear by smart materials. They're a lifesaver, especially if you're new to asset texturing. They are, you know, an absolute godsend because you don't really have to worry about so much stuff. It kind of does it for you, and then you have that extra time to be able to go through and actually start like learning and kind of playing around with like the different settings of everything that's offered. So like you can see like some of these have like folds in them, so you can kind of add to that if you want. This one has like more of like a rough look. Like there's just so much. This one's like wood. There's so much, and of course there's more that can always be purchased or downloaded. I think it's great. Before I actually start texturing this, and I am really sorry if I'm not doing the best at explaining this. Like I've said, I've tried to redo this so many times. There's just so much. My brain kind of gets overwhelmed with how much to tell you guys. Speaking of saving, let's go ahead and save so that we don't lose it. Okay, so I just wanted to save it real quick so that it didn't go away. It does crash. My computer's very old and struggles to run anything. But I do recommend saving periodically. It doesn't really, I mean, it does have that autosave feature, but it only pops up like every, I don't know, 5-10 minutes or so. And a lot can change in those times. So I would definitely recommend saving it whenever you can so that you don't lose your project. But yeah, I'm going to link in the description down below. And I'm going to make a cut real quick so I can make a little note. But this custom base material, do you guys see how much of a difference that makes in terms of like the shadows? Right? And I can go through and I can change like the blur and the balance. Like I can adjust this to however I need it to be to kind of fix the shadows. But this is actually something that I made myself. via a tutorial from Crabman. He shows us how to make our own base material, and the whole point of the tutorial is to be able to have a custom material that we can drop onto our assets to have like extra shading and start kind of adding some lighting to the texture, but we don't have to go through and reset it up each individual time. That's why we saved it as our own custom smart material. To be honest, I set this up over a year ago. I don't remember at all how it's done, so I'm going to link that tutorial down below. I highly recommend that you guys give that a watch and save and make your own custom base material, because sometimes I'll come through and I'm like, oh, I kind of, I maybe don't want as much light, or I don't want as much shadow, or I'll come over here and where is it? If I go to light, I can change the angle. Like I kind of want it, I have a lot more control over the way the shadows are cast. So it's something that I use on every single one of my assets. And I would highly recommend that you guys go ahead and check out that tutorial, which I'm going to make a cut real quick and just go make a little note of that so that I remember to leave that in the description for you guys. Okay, so I'm going to proceed with editing my smart material. I normally come through and turn off all of these. Best way I can explain it is I'm turning off everything other than the color, because I want it to only worry about casting shadows. I don't want it to worry about how rough or any like normals. So normals and heights are what give that I guess more of like a 3D pattern look instead of it being flat like we saw earlier with like the checkers and the fabric. It gives that fabric look that was being controlled through a normal map, which we can get into a little bit more later. But whenever I come to my shadows, I turn off everything other than color, because I don't want it to worry about anything other than the shadows. So I'm going to go through and play around with my settings a little bit and kind of get it to where I would like everything to be. Okay, so I've got everything situated on how I want it to be. And like I said, if you want to know how to get or to set up all these settings that I have, I would definitely recommend watching the video in the description, and it will walk you through how to set everything up. But the reason why I set it up is because if I was to just have my textures, this is what it would look like. The base color alone, I just changed it up here from material to base color. Base color alone is so important, especially if you're wanting to become like an asset creator and you're wanting to sell your assets. It's so important because for anybody that's going to be making like quest avatars or optimized avatars, it's more helpful to focus on the base color than the full material setup, because like quest can't use, or I'm sorry, I think I misspoke. It's more important to focus on the base color instead of the material version, because quest can't have special material set up like Poiomi. So they rely on just the base color alone, which right now would have been just flat. But with that custom material that we set up, now it has those shadings. So now it looks, you can see all of that, the folds that we did, which is so helpful, because now if somebody is wanting to put this on like a quest avatar or something, they still get, a proper texture that looks like as if it was like a PC texture instead of just like a really flat, sad texture. So I definitely switch between base and material preview pretty often. Something else about the material preview is you have to realize with Unity, it all depends on how the person sets it up. And in Blender, like they don't have to add in the roughness map or the metallic map. Like they can adjust that if they want to manually themselves. Because a lot of times I find that the material preview kind of makes things look more shiny and rubbery than it actually turns out. But that's also because like sometimes I'll add the roughness, map in Blender, and I'll be like, oh, actually I don't really like how it transferred out, so I'll take it off and then I'll just manually control the roughness. The more important maps, I think, are your base and your normal. And we don't have anything on it, so our normal is flat. But again, like I said before, the normal is kind of what's going to give it some like actual like texture to make it look like clothing. So I'm going to delete this layer real quick. because we don't need it. So once you have your base material, assuming that you went through and followed that tutorial, I change it to multiply, so then that way I can put other textures below it. So let me show you guys. So if I do normal, and let's say, I'm trying to think what would be a good one. I'm just going to drag this one on it. It's black. I'm sorry, that probably makes it hard to see. But you can see it's got like some texturing on it, which is cool, but now my stuff isn't showing up. So if I drag that on top, okay, well now it is showing up, but it's all white and it looks kind of funny. So I change it to multiply, and that way it kind of adds some of that like extra shading back. So you see here on like the folds, you can see them, but not the clearest, but now you can like really see that shadow there. So that is probably the only part of this tutorial that I'm going to have that's not directly like something that I'm going to be showing you guys, but I would recommend watching that video so that you can have the custom base material set up. If you don't want to do that, there's something at the end that I will show you guys to do. I use both for my assets. That will still help you get that lighting showing on your base color. That I find really helpful, but it does lag out my computer, so I save it until the end. So I'm going to start with this fabric here, except I'm going to change this to a different color. And I think I want to start off with like a really deep red. So I'm just going to change it to a red, and you can see it in our base color. It's even more red. And the reason that that difference is because we have like, you know, these extra maps on here, so you can control the roughness. Let me go back into material. You won't really be able to see anything other than the default if you stay on base color. So if you want to like mess with everything else, you need to stay on the material preview. You can change the roughness here, and you can see it makes it a lot more like metallic-y. So you can choose just how, like, if you want it to have some of that shine or not. Which, I want this to stay fabric, so I'm going to keep the roughness turned all the way up. But all of these little, like, bumps are our normal map, which is now not wanting to show up, of course. There we go. So that's what the normal map is it's all that little, you know, texturing. And you'll notice that that doesn't show up on the base color. That is, again, something that I will show you guys at the very end. It helps to like kind of bake in the normal map and your shadows and all of that onto your base color. So that way, you know how you'll see like asset creators that are like, look, the base color looks just like the material view, which is super impressive. That's how is they'll go through and like do different things. Kind of once they have like the basics of it done. And I'll show you guys one of the things that I know how to do at the end because it lags out my computer. So, if you ever like decide that you don't want something, like you can always look at toggling on and off. Like that's the height map, right? So like that's the color map. Like you can just toggle on and off these materials. You can also come up here and I'll toggle on and off these things and like kind of play around and see like, okay, does that color change anything? A little bit. If you look here on our UV, you can see that these highlights are white versus now they like blend in more. So if I change them to blue, they have a, it's so hard to see probably, but they are changing color. So I'm probably going to change that back to white, and they have it turned down to 1. This is the opacity. So if we up it, you can see exactly like where it's applying. So if you wanted to have like blue highlights for some reason, then you could, and you could always like kind of give it like a blue highlight that way, and like you could play with the opacity here. So the best way I can explain Substance Painter for me is I just really came through and started like, that's going to give it more of like a satiny look. Like it's really cool just truly going around and clicking on things and playing with values and kind of just figuring out, you know, what does what. The height map, as you can see on all these like folds and stuff, because that's what it's focusing on, I can kind of make it more indented, or I can kind of tell it to rise almost. or indent, right? So I think it's really, really cool. So if I wanted those folds to be more predominant, then I could up the height map, and that's going to add shadows around them to kind of make them look as if they were higher up. And that's the beauty of texturing and baking, is, you know, we can come through and we have our low poly base without any of these folds on it. Like you can see right here, like that's flat, but it's just kind of like a trick of the eye. It looks like as if there's an actual fold there, and there's not. So I find it really, really cool. So I am going to come through and just kind of tone that down. I do kind of want to leave the red highlight. I kind of like how it looks. See, it's just the tiniest bit of difference, but I feel like when it comes to texturing, the small things like stack up to make a really big difference. So I really like how this is looking so far. I still feel like it's a little too shiny, but that's okay. We will fix that later. So, I mean, I could probably walk away and just like leave this as is right now, but like I said, I wanted to add lace and I want to add stitching and all this other kind of stuff. So I'm going to show you guys how I normally go through and do that. But yeah, I would definitely recommend coming through and like playing with all of these different smart materials. Like I said, there's ones that have like these extra folds on them. Some of them, like, they'll make it to where the edges, like this one, the edges are more like rough, right? And the cool thing is like all these different materials have different things. This is edges highlight, so that's that kind of highlighting. And then there's the leather pattern, and there's the damages, and like what you don't know and you can just kind of click through is like they have all these different filters and maps, so that's how you can adjust the colors. Come into this mask editor. It's basically telling it, like on the edges one, it's telling it to read anywhere that we had those sculpts, right? So anywhere that on real life clothing it would consider like an edge of a fold, and it's telling it to apply there via this mask editor. So we could go through with the blur, we can do more of a balance and like, you know, thickness. I don't know, like I feel like Substance Painter can be very overwhelming for a lot of people, and it was for me whenever I first started, but truly I think the best way is just go through and start playing around with, you know, different sliders, and also kind of keep in mind that like multiply, like if you know anything about 2D drawing, it's a lot of the same kind of stuff, like overlay and screen are going to make it brighter, versus this like multiply and divide and stuff is going to, you know, be more of like how the light like sits on it. You can do like a soft light or a hard light. Like there's all kinds of crazy stuff that you can do. So definitely play around with it. You know, and you can stack up all kinds of different colors and patterns and stuff. Like I said, you know, you could go through and add your checker print underneath this if you wanted to. And, you know, feel free to hide different layers and just kind of play around sliders until you get it how you want it to. Is the best way I can try to help you guys like prepare for this part of it. But I'm sorry, that's probably not the best advice, but I'm going to go ahead and move on to stitching. There is an auto stitcher, so I'm going to grab a completely different, I'm just going to put this one back on, but it's black, so it'll be different. There is such a thing as an auto stitcher, and it's going to go based off of where you marked your UV editing. So to show you guys that, there's a thing called masks in Substance Painter. So if you right click and you do add black mask, this is going to, if I pick a paintbrush, a black mask is going to hide everything on that layer, and anywhere that you paint is where that new layer is going to show up, right? And then if you do a white mask, it's going to do the opposite. It's going to show the layer, and anywhere you paint is where that layer goes away. So masks are like going to be your best friend. I use them religiously. But on a mask, I like using masks because it lets me like control where I'm wanting stuff, but also I can come back into here, and let's say I decide later on that I actually want this to be blue. I can come through and change the material settings themselves without having to like, so if I just threw down a layer and if I right click and I do add paint, so I can paint on it now, and I come through and I start, let me make it a different color so it's easier. So if I come through and I start painting, I don't know why it's showing up white. I don't normally paint like this anyways, but my point is, like, so now I want to do the height and the roughness and the metallic different. I don't know why it's... Anyways, my point is that masks are just easier to control. It lets you go through and edit things, especially if you're like putting down like a stamp, like a logo or something. Then you don't have to like put it down, be like, okay, I want to fix it, erase that, put it down, fix it, put it down. You can just go through and edit it and then like go back to your mask. So that's the point I was trying to get across. Like I said, there's still so much that I have to learn. I'm just going to leave it black for now, so it'll be a bit easier for me. Okay. So on my mask, I normally do add paint just so I can keep things in like different, almost like layers. But you can go through and you can do right click, and I believe it's add generator and auto stitch. And it will auto add all these stitches for you, and you can adjust the positions. You know, kind of like zoom it in or out. You can do stitch size, width. You can kind of see it changing over here on our, so this over here is our UV map. And you can play around with like the stitch width, the roundness, the length. Put in, you know, I don't really know much about curvatures. You can do mask mode as UV mask. You can do it as curvature, which I think is more so trying to follow the like actual curves. And then you can do custom input, which I don't know anything about. But UV map is cool because it does that. It goes through on your UV map, and everything that you have blocked out, it's going to go through and put stitches on, which can be really cool if you're super duper good at UV unwrapping, but I am not, as discussed before, so I don't use auto stitching. I go through and I manually add stitching. I also feel like I have better control over it. So that's what I'm going to show you guys how to do. I come over to, I believe it is brushes, and I type in stitch. And I click on stitches straight, and I'll double click that, and you can see it changed it over here. So now if I come through and I draw down, you can see like this little stitching pattern. But I want to change, and I'm gonna be real honest with you guys, I completely forgot how to do it to where it's like a masking thing. I don't remember how actually, to where you can like change it like that, the brush, like change the brush, and it'll change it over here real time. I'll see if I can find the tutorial. It's been a while since I watched it. But you can kind of see it up here changing, and that's what I'm going to work on. Okay, so the black almost kind of treated it like an alpha, so I changed it to white. Now it's all showing up better. So this is kind of what I was talking about with like the layers being really helpful though in the mask. So I have my mask and I'm painting directly on the mask. So if I hide that, it goes away, but my layer is still there. So this is when I can come into here and I can go to the roughness, and I can make the stitches more like shiny and metallic if I wanted to. You know, I can come over to the wear and I can mess with the height and kind of make the stitches like look as if they're like rising up a little bit versus being imprinted. That doesn't seem like that changes anything. So I don't know, like I just find it really helpful. I am going to pick a different material though, because I don't like the way that that one is working. So give me just a second. Much better. So now if I come through on this one and I go to the height details, I can kind of mess around with the settings here, which that doesn't seem to be what I want it to be. So maybe it's on the base color. Seems to be. So now here on the base color, I can up the height and kind of make the stitches imprinted or rise. And I normally make mine rise a little bit, make them a little bit rougher. And then I can come back up here and go to my paint, and I'll be able to continue. So I'm going to make a new paint layer. Right. and I'll go through and start adding my stitching wherever I feel like adding it. So before I start anything where I'm hand painting, there's two things that I always turn on. I turn on this like triangle thing, which is symmetry, which I don't know why it's not, there it goes. And it's going to obviously cut it in half. Now I do have to be careful because of the bow over here. I won't be able to I won't be able to mirror that one, but I can go through and you can use these and just scooch it over if you want to. But I'm not too worried about that right now, so I'm going to reset that to 0. You don't have to have the plane on. I normally leave it off. But then that way, anything I do on one side is showing on the other. Since we did make this robe symmetrical, then it'll be super duper helpful. For instances like this, so I don't have to go through and do it all twice. I can only do one side and I know that it's going to match the other. The other thing I turn on is this little like trail up here. It's called Lazy Mouse. And I normally keep my distance turned down. You can make it higher or not. Again, if you're familiar with like 2D drawing at all, you know how some of your brushes and your pens, whenever you go to draw, will like kind of like lag behind where you put your hand or your physical pen. This does the same thing. So like, see that circle is where my mouse is, but it's showing up behind it and I can up it even more. But that helps it kind of smooth out, so I can do something like this versus, see how this one's like a more like smooth like curve versus this one's a little bit more rugged, because this was just me trying to freehand it, versus if I take it slower, and especially using, even if I go faster, like it still keeps it much more accurate. So I normally use both of those. I'll turn on my symmetry and I'll turn on my Lazy Mouse and maybe adjust my size a little bit. See, now I feel like that makes my stitching like too like close together. So let's try to fix this a little bit more. Let's do our width and our contrast maybe. I'm going to play around with this until I get it how I want it to be. Okay, so I kind of fiddled around with the settings as you saw there and got it to a size that I like. And I'm also not too worried about it being like super contrasting, because that's something that we're going to change later. So I'm going to make this into a time lapse just so you guys don't have to watch it, because it's going to take me a while. I personally go through and add my stitching on all of the like outer parts, because I'm trying to think of like clothing in real life. Like, where do I see stitching? So I see it like around the arms or maybe on the underarms, maybe kind of on the edges. So that's where I'm going to go through and add it. You can add it wherever you want to, but I'm going to go through and add my stitching now, and then we will move on to the next part. Oh, before I get started, something else that you can do if you want to create like a straight line is you can like click, hold shift and drag your mouse down, and you'll see it makes this like line, and then you can click again and it makes the lines, which I'll sometimes use for like, and I'll just like rapid click to kind of help me like go around a curve exactly how I'm wanting it to. So yeah. Okay, so I'm not going to worry about the bow because it's, for whatever reason, like being really finicky. But that's probably just because of the way I unwrapped it versus the way I unwrapped it the first time, but I'm not too worried about it right now. I just wanted to be able to show you guys how I like manually go through and stitch. I didn't do the edges like down here, this area, because, and down here, because I actually want to go through and add lace on those sections. I also sometimes do it in base color just because it's a little bit easier for me to see. So yeah, now that I have that done, I am actually going to erase this part real quick, because I don't really like the way that this one came out. I'm going to turn this off because that's annoying. Oh. Apologies. Turn back on my mirror modifier. And just gonna erase that real quick and just re-add it. Okay, so I don't really like how like contrasting that it is. So what I normally do is I'll come through and maybe add like change this to multiply, and I'll turn down the opacity. I'm doing this all on the wrong layer. But turn down the opacity just so that it kind of adds just the tiniest little bit of something there. But it's not overwhelming. Actually, changing that to multiply was horrible. So let's try pass through. Right, just to kind of give it like a little bit of like an outline kind of there, just to kind of give it some more dimension. So the next thing that I want to show you guys is the alphas, but before we do that, I want to talk to you guys about stamps. So if you come over here to alphas, these are just some that Substance Painter comes with, as well as some that I have imported. So I'm just going to use like this arrow. I'm not going to use it on this actually. Let's make a new smart material. Let's make it copper. Something that contradicts so that you guys can see. I'm going to put this on a black mask again, and I'm going to add paint again. Then if I come over here to my alpha, so the alpha is going to register off of whatever your last brush was. So since my last brush was the Stitches brush, it's not really going to show up very well. So I'm going to head back over to the brushes tab and click the basic card. Double click it to get it. Sometimes it doesn't want to reset. So just come down to where you see, it's either normally here in the alpha or the grayscale spot, and just X that out. And then just double click and you'll see that that refreshed. So now we should be good to go. So now if I come over here to the alpha spot, and I forgot which one I was going to do, but let's just say this one. I double click it, you'll say that it refreshed there, but the actual like brush stayed the same, like it's not showing up the stitches anymore. And I prefer just setting it to the hard one, the basic card, because a lot of these, like the ones that I've imported, are like paint brushes, or like this one has some like blur on the end, and this one has like this like chalk effect. So if you set it to this one, then you know that that circle that you have is like solid, so it's going to pick up your stamp, and then you can just stamp away. Versus if I was to like do this one and then do this, see, it kind of, I mean, and that's a super cool effect. So that is something that you could do, is like play around with effects, kind of by using like the different brush combinations and the alpha combinations to get all kinds of like really cool things to show up. But yeah, if you ever just want to like have like a normal stamp, or like for, you know, like cypunk or cyberpunk stuff, if I change this back to basic card and I come down here and do this like atom thing and like stamp that on, and then same thing as before, I can come into my layer and I can like up the height, so it kind of makes it like pop out, or I can make it kind of indented. Like there's all kinds of crazy stuff that you guys can do with alphas and stamps. Somewhere in here, as you can see, I have a ton that I've imported, but somewhere in here I imported my Miro logo. Oh, I just passed it. I've lost it again. That's okay. But yeah, somewhere in here I've imported my Miro logo, and on some heels that I made for my avatar Atara, I went through and put my logo on like the sole of her heels, so no one could really see it, but it was kind of like my own like little like designer brand. So that's something that you could do, is you could like import your logo. You would just drag in your image and drop it into this section, kind of like you do for, you know, assets in Unity. You just drag and drop it in there, and it'll pop up a little window, and it'll say like, what do you want to import this as? And there's like a little drop down, it'll say like material or texture. Texture is kind of like these brushes, and then for stamps, like you would just change it to alpha so that it shows up in this window, and you could do something like that with it. So that way you could make it like any color you wanted to. I'll also link a description down below of like how I learned how to do stamps. So let's go ahead and get rid of these, although the copper is gorgeous. So I think now I'm going to pick out a different, potentially, material. Okay, I'm not going to pick out a new material. I'm going to duplicate this one. And I'm actually going to rename this so that I know what is what. So I'm just like double clicking so that I can keep track. So I want this to actually be white. I'm gonna make this just slightly darker so that it has some contrast to it. I'm gonna add my black mask again and my paint layer. And now we're going to work on adding our lace. So there's a few different ways that you could do this. I'm again going to come in here, just click hard. And in my alphas, I have already gone through, I think I got these from like ArtStation. There's a few VR chat creators that will sell alphas. So you can go to like Jinxie and just type in like alpha or like tattoo maybe. I think that'll mostly pull up like tattoo textures. But if you search alpha, there's quite a few creators I know of that do sell them. Or like I said, you can go to like ArtStation or somewhere. And just make sure that the license that you're getting for whatever you're buying does say commercial. But I had found some, I believe off of ArtStation is where I got these. Just some different alpha designs that I have imported. So that's what I'm going to be using. And I think I'm going to use this one. So I'm just going to double click that one. So now you can see it showing up on my brush, but when I click and drag, it's not doing anything. Well, first off, I put my paint on the wrong layer, so hold on. Oh, hold on. Double click. There we go. So right, so now it's like dragging it doesn't do what we want it to do. So if we click it, okay, we can kind of see it there. If we up the scale, we can still kind of see it, but it's not doing anything alpha related. So if you remember at the very beginning of this video, I talked about in the shader settings that I needed to change it to the alpha blending. You can change it to, I think this one's like, yeah, alpha test. And so you need that, but it's still not working. The reason is we need to come into our material, whether you used a smart material. You could also do this is called a fill layer, just this button. And it kind of like, let's make this a different color, has all of your stuff already set up. So if we did something like this, but we don't want any metal, we don't need emissions, you could just, do that, and then that way you can still control it. It's just not directly through a smart material. So I guess just to make things easier, I'll go ahead and do that. So I'll make this white. And like I said, the only reason I like smart materials is because sometimes it adds like that extra little bit of a texture to it. And again, you can always play around with like overlays and screens. Like you can play around with all of these different things as well to kind of make it show up different, so to speak. All right. Anyways, so you can go through and like play around with your height and of course your roughness, and don't really have to worry about your normals. But this opacity is what we're going to need. So I'm going to make this rise up just a little bit. I do want the roughness to stay maximized. I don't think by default you'll see the opacity like spot on whether you're using a smart material or a fill layer, doesn't matter. So if you don't see that, you need to come up here back to the little, or not to the ball, I'm sorry, to the one right above it, the little like computer screen. No? I'm saying all the wrong things. Okay, I'm so sorry. I said all the wrong things. All of them. So if you don't see the opacity down there, you come up here to the very, very top, this little like paper looking icon thing. It's called texture set settings. And if I get rid of opacity, so you can't see it, it's not down there. Oh no. You just come up here and you click that and it says channels. There's a little plus sign. You'll click plus and then it should pop up right there. You can click opacity and now it'll pop up for you. So if you head back over to your spot, you can change the opacity level, and that's how you make alphas. So now if you see, let me kind of zoom around to the, oh goodness, inside here. So now you can kind of, if I can get it to sit right, now you can see that it's opaque. So, and you can go through and adjust it if you want it to be completely cut out or just a little bit. I will say, just a little heads up, I've set it to like 7.7 or so before. And whenever I get into Blender, it's like way more see-through than it looks like here. And it's really hard to tell because we're just seeing the same color behind it. So just kind of keep that in mind, that, you know, if you want to have it super low just to kind of know what it's going to look like, that's fine. But whenever you get it into Blender, which I definitely recommend testing your materials before anything, you might actually want to come through and adjust it. I think most of the time I normally have to leave it somewhere around the 0.9 or 0.8. But I'm going to leave it turned down quite a ways so that it's just a bit easier for us to see. Here we go. Something like that, just so that you guys can like kind of a little bit more easily see that opacity that we're talking about there. So I'm going to leave that there, and I'm just going to reset my black mask. So there's two different ways that we can actually add this onto our asset. We can go through and manually attach it, which this is all important to the alignment. So tangent wrap kind of means like how this kind of curves. This is going to curve with it if we were to stamp it on. That is tangent wrap. So if we change it to tangent planner, it's still going to curve, but like it doesn't quite curve the same way. Like it kind of stretches more here, is I guess the best way to explain it. I normally only use tangent wrap or UV. So UV, you can see, well, now it's upside down. Why is it upside down, Chin? Well, that's because it's reading off of this. So this is really helpful for if you're wanting to do like specific things regarding your UV. So this might be more helpful if we wanted to. And it does kind of, I kind of have to switch between the two whenever I'm doing alphas. So if I come here, oops, I'm just holding control and swooshing around my angle, which sometimes it changes like the flow and opacity and stuff, so just keep that in mind. But now I can actually directly stamp onto my UV, and it's going to register based off of whatever, you know, my UV is. So it's a little bit more control that way, I guess is the best way to put it. It might not sound like you really need to ever change the alignment, but whenever I'm adding stamps, especially with things like lacing and I'm going like around a curve or an object, sometimes it'll stretch kind of funny, or I won't be able to get the it to line up the same way, right? So then like if I come down here and I'm like, oh, I can't get it to line up, then I might have to come into my UV and be like, okay, let me actually change that, and now I have a little bit more control of where that, you know, next piece lines up. So that's the best way I can explain that whenever you're coming and adding stamps. So I want it to do something like this. Like I want the edge, the sleeves, to be the lace, like it ends with that, and then all of this bit gets erased. So the best way to do that, because right now if we keep going through and doing this, like we can see the lace looks pretty, but like it has this like edge part that we don't really want. That's not how lace like works. It's a little bit finicky to do this, so I deeply apologize. I'm gonna do my best. I'm probably gonna go through and play with it and then like recount my steps to you guys out loud. But we kind of have to do like a weird workaround when it comes to the opacity to get it to do what we're wanting it to do. So I'm going to turn that off for now. Okay, sorry for the cut there. I always struggle to remember how to do this because it's like a little bit of like a backwards process. So I wanted to go through and like test it and make sure that I had it correct. So like I was saying with our lace, we were still getting like this edge of our asset to show, which is not what we want. We actually want it to end with the lace. So we need to do a little bit of like backwards, I forget what the word is, but like backwards thinking of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a fill layer. We're going to turn off color, height, rough metal, normal emission, so that this is nothing but opacity. We're going to turn it all the way down so that it completely vanishes. And we're going to add a black mask. And I'm going to come in here on my brush with just a normal hard brush. And you can go through, making sure my mirror modifier is still on. And we can erase, just kind of for example. I'm not going to make it perfect. But we're going to basically erase like where we're going to want that lace to be. So if we want it to, you know, it doesn't have to be this wide, but we want it to be on the edge of our sleeves. So we just kind of erased it. So if we go back into our base color, you can see like that's where it ends, but we erased it with the opacity. So since we made that layer completely opaque and we used a black mask to only paint where we wanted it, that's how we manage that. So you're going to want to do that to paint where you want your lace to be. And then you can make another layer. And I'm going to turn off metal and emission because I don't want those. I really liked how the overlay kind of looked, so I'm going to put that back on. I'm going to raise the height a little bit, and I want it rough all the way. I'm going to add a black mask back onto it. I'm still on the hard brush, and I come back over here to my alphas. I pick out my lace. Now, if I line it up, ta-da! Now it ends with our lace. And what that is basically doing is if we come onto our base color, because, you know, like quests and stuff can't use alpha, so I'm just kind of using them for an example, but this is like what they would see. So there, you know, like if you were wanting to sell this with like quest users in mind, we might make a separate version without the lace so that they can still use this texture without it looking kind of funny. But basically what that's doing is we're telling all the maps, like once we apply it in Blender and Unity, that the alpha is going to erase this part of the sleeve, but we went back over it with a new layer and painted back on top of the part that it erased to make it show up, if that kind of makes sense. So now we can get our sleeves to end with lace. Ta-da! So very, very interesting kind of a way, but it took me a long time to be able to go through and figure out how people were getting like lace tips. And that's how I have figured it out. So if you want to, you can also still come through and like make that lace kind of see-through. You can make it like solid, of course, if you want to, but you can also, of course, make it, you know, opaque if you wanted it to have its own kind of like sheerness to it. But yeah, so I'm going to go through and add the lace to the sleeves and the bottom of the train, and then I will be right back with you guys to show you the last steps that I do whenever I go to finish up an asset. Alrighty. So I have finished going through and adding some of the lace everywhere, and during the editing, if you guys had seen, I threw up some little tips and tricks that I was thinking of while I was doing the lace, such as on the layer where we had like drawn out our alpha, you can always go into the opacity to kind of see like a better view of where it is and draw more, as well as erase if you need to. And then I also went through on the fill layer for the lace and went through with just a normal like hard brush and went back over the edge just to kind of make it a little bit more seamless, to kind of make it look more cohesive instead of having that little rigid edge from each one of the stamps. So now it kind of looks like it's all one part. And then there at the end, I just went through and I just kind of adjusted the colors a little bit more and the wear a little bit more, just to give it a little bit more of a highlight, and not quite like a satiny look, but I wanted it to have a little bit more than just the flat color. So I just kind of gave it a little bit more highlight with that wear there. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with how it looks. I'm not too worried about the bow because it's just supposed to be just like little tie around thing. So I don't really want it to have too many details as much as I did the robe. So I think that pretty much concludes the majority of texturing this. We got our stitching, our shadows, our lace is all added. very simple, very elegant. So now the last thing that I do before I start exporting my textures or any different color variants that I'm going to do, of course I'll export one and go test it into Blender just to make sure if I need to change like the opacity or anything like I had said before. But there is one more thing that I do just to kind of help this base color go from looking flat without any of those stitching details or that fabric detailing like on the material view. Is I go through and I actually add, let me come over here, I think it's this one, under filters, yes, this baked lighting environment. So I'll toss that on. I normally stay in base color for this. This is more so for the base color than it is for the material. For the material, in my opinion, it makes it look a lot more metallic-y and shiny than I want it to be. So I normally do this for the base color because I want my base colors to have that kind of a detail. And I also definitely recommend saving before you do this. At least for my computer, this tends to lag me out pretty hard. But whenever you throw it on, it's going to default to pass through, and it's going to put on this filter for you for the baked lighting environment. And if you come down here, this won't show up properly, like you won't see your little texture and the ambient occlusion and normal if you haven't already baked your material. So if you haven't already baked it, make sure that you go back through and you bake it if you're wanting to add this. If you don't want to worry about baking, then don't worry about it. But since we did that at the very beginning of this video, then all these maps are already showing up because they've already been generated. So then I come over here to this like last little folder. It's called environments, and there's all kinds of different ones, and I'm pretty sure that there's more that you can find somewhere to import. I just haven't imported any more of my own. I'm not really too sure where to get more, but again, I would check like the Substance Painter community or their website. But yeah, I normally stick around with these like soft lighting ones down here, but sometimes these front ones really add like some cool effects. So just kind of for example, I'm gonna grab this entry forest. It's very like green, and you drag it over here into your environment map. As you can see, it's now loaded on, but it kind of changed the colors, and that's because it's literally saying that this environment, you're wanting to bake it directly onto your material. So we can do like this one, kind of gives it more of like an overcast day kind of a vibe. And like I said, it definitely changes the lighting. So I think I normally do this one. And it's still like too bright, but you can see that it's now putting in those stitches and our fabric material is now showing up more. So you can just kind of play around with the different maps and see which one that you like better. But I really like how the back of this one looks. I just wish that it was more on the front. I have tried adding 2 things of baked lighting, and that doesn't work out very well for me. But yeah, just kind of like for an example, like you can see this. And if you wanted to like flip this around, you can mess around with the vertical and horizontal rotations over here. And you can see it's going to like swoosh around on your project to kind of adjust to where you're asking it to go. You can adjust the exposure, which will make it more bright. Height intensity, which of course is just going to be how much is those height maps showing up. And then your ambient occlusion and your specular is just to do with the lighting. So I'm going to reset all of that to default and keep playing around until I found one that I like. Something else is I'll turn off the custom base material. It kind of helps the lag a little bit. So I kind of got it to a spot that I am somewhat happy with. It's not my favorite, but that's okay. The whole point of it is just to give the base material something that looks a little bit nicer, which is probably what I will do, and I'll probably make 2 versions, like with the lace and then one without for anybody that wants the lace not there. But something else you can do just to kind of see the difference is up here. If I just turn down the opacity of the layer, this is what the base color looked like before versus this is what it looks like after. So you can see it adds those shadows a lot more, and it adds that height detail so that your base color looks a little bit more like as if it was an actual material and had all the maps on it. So that being said, you can go ahead and come up here and you can go to export textures. Before I click this, this is what I was talking about earlier at the very beginning of the video when I said that if you use auto unwrap that you would have to export your mesh out of Substance Painter because it basically generates its own UV for that mesh, and so you need that mesh to go with it. This is where you would do that. You would just hit export mesh and then you would export it there. I would suggest leaving off apply triangulation. That's gonna make your UV go from the squares that we are used to into triangles, and just a little bit messier to work with. So if you do end up using the auto unwrap, definitely make sure to uncheck mark that, and then you can export from there. But I'm going to export my textures instead. And before I do, I'm gonna rename this rope lace, and I'll show you guys why I'm doing that here in just a second, but I'm going to export, and here you can click on it and you can decide, like, if you're only wanting to export a specific map for some reason, then you can come through and uncheck mark that, which I'll put to use in a minute. But then you can come through on your global settings in your output directory. I know I've covered it up, but this is just basically showing where your output directory is, and I'm just covering it up because it has my real life information. So you can just navigate over to wherever it is that you're wanting to save your textures. Oops. So I'm going to make a new folder and I'm going to call it rope textures. And I normally go through and I make the first one called maps. And that way it's just a little bit easier for anyone, and I'll show you guys what I'm going to do here in just a second, but I'm going to basically keep my like normal height, ambient occlusion, opacity maps, all that kind of stuff in one folder, and then in a outer folder I'll keep all the actual colors, so it's just a little bit easier for people to kind of navigate what they're needing. And then you click export and it's going to go through and it's going to do it, and once it's done loading down here at the bottom, then you're good to go. So just to kind of show you why I said I renamed it and about the like different map parts. So if I change this to just like robe 1, or let's do robe no lace 1, and I put a 1 because I'm going to go through and do different colors, but then I can come up here and I can uncheck mark that so all the lace is hidden. It's a little bit more quest friendly. I can come and export textures. And if I wanted to, like if this was just a different color variant, then I could uncheck mark all of this. And so it's only exporting the color so that I don't have duplicates of all of the other maps, you know, however many times over. Because you really only need it the once. Having the color change isn't going to affect the other maps. So it's just a little bit easier for you to only export like the color if you need to. But since I'm exporting a new type, then I'll come in here and I'll make a new subfolder and I'll say no lace maps. And that way if somebody wants the version without lace, then they have those maps separated. So it's, again, a little bit easier for them. So now I could come through and I'll just, you know, I'll probably leave it as lace and I'll just change the number. And I'll go through and change the color and then export just the base color each time. And then I'll change the name to no lace number 2, no lace 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth. And I'll leave that lace layer hidden so that way I can get all my colors with and without lace and keep everything separated. And just to kind of show you guys like why I keep everything separated for like maps and no maps. So like here's my base color. I'm just going to drag that out there so that, you know, I'll have all of my colors here and then all the maps here. And then I'll do no lace maps, and maybe I can do like no lace colors, and I'll just drag that in there. So then again, it's just a little bit more easy for anyone that wants one version or the other to navigate to wherever they need. And they of course can always rearrange it if they need to, but yeah, so like that way whenever I go into Blender, I can just make my, or Unity, make my material, assign all of my maps that I need to, and then whenever I go to change the color, I only have to come to this one spot and change it instead of having to like scroll through a whole ton of maps duplicated over and over and over. So that is how you export out of Substance Painter. So I think that wraps up everything that we need for this tutorial. So let's head on over to the wrap-up stage. Alrighty, so that is concluding our texturing of our asset in our little miniature How to Make Clothing series. So like I said at the beginning of the video, the next tutorial will be, we'll be back in Blender, and we're going to be working on rigging this and weight painting it to our base, as well as we're going to do some extra rigging to make the sleeves and the train and maybe the bow as well. All have separate bones so that, if somebody wants to add fizz bones in Unity to make all of those flow, then they can. So we will cover that in the next video. Just as a little recap for today, we pretty much stayed in Substance Painter. We talked about a lot. I tried my best to remember to explain every little thing that I could. There's just so much in Substance Painter. So I am really sorry if it's not as in-depth as some of you might have liked, but I am going to link multiple different tutorials down below that I used to help get myself familiar with Substance Painter, and I hope those find helpful to you guys as well. But I wanted this to just kind of be a basic of like, here's how I texture my assets so that you guys kind of have my workflow, and if you want to start learning how to texture assets, and you can follow these exact same steps and do some basic texturing. Like I said, there's all kinds of like fancy stuff that you can do in Substance Painter. I'm not the most familiar with really anything outside of what I showed you guys today. Give or take a few small things that will be in the tutorials listed in the description down below. So I hope that this kind of helps you guys get a general start to Substance Painter. I'd really truly stand by that. I think that the more that you just play around in Substance Painter and play with the different sliders and the different smart materials and things like that, you'll kind of get more adjusted to it. And it's not really as overwhelming as it might seem at first. And it's also, if you have like 2D knowledge, just kind of keeping in mind of like whenever you're drawing or painting in 2D, like I said, like the filters of like multiply, pass through, overlay. And if you're not familiar with any of that, I definitely recommend looking up whichever one you're interested in and kind of getting the general definition of what that one does. But again, just playing around with it and seeing how it messes around with the lighting and the shading of your asset. And I think that would be really helpful. It's a big part of how I learned Substance Painter, is just kind of going around and clicking buttons. But yeah, this is pretty much my full scope of Substance Painter. Give or take, like I said, a few things in the descriptions below. But we covered how to add stamps and alphas and art lace. We talked about auto stitching and manually adding stitching, as of course the smart materials, the normal materials, changing color, things like that. And again, for the last part of the tutorial, you don't have to worry about the base color of your material if you don't want to, but it is very helpful, especially for people that are making quest and optimized avatars, to be able to have not only all the parts of clothing on one material, like we have our bow and our robe on one, but also to be able to have that base color, to have those same details. It just helps a lot whenever it comes to optimizing and making quest avatars, since we can't always add all the fancy maps to those types of avatars. So that being said, I hope that this helped. I am more than happy to answer any questions, just like always, in the comments down below or in my Discord server. But please bear in mind that I am not overly skilled in Substance Painter. I am by far not the best texturer out there amongst all the asset creators, by far. I will say something that I think a lot of people underestimate is the use of stamps. So like my lace is a stamp. There's so many gorgeous assets that are cyberpunk themed or super fantasy themed that have all these pretty swirls and designs. Some of it is definitely hand painted, or it might be like hand drawn and then they imported it as a stamp into Substance Painter. I would definitely not underestimate going to places like the Substance Painter community, or their website, or ArtStation, or DeviantArt, anywhere that sells like licenses to different like stamps and alphas, because a lot of artists will go through and make like Uni. If anyone is familiar with Uni's work, she's a really popular tattoo artist in the VR chat community. I absolutely love her work. She has some that she'll go through and she'll draw on her iPad or whatever tool she uses, and she'll draw up these designs and she'll send them as alpha. So it's just a black and white image, and you can use that and import that into Substance Painter and add that onto your asset. And there's been quite a few like cyber assets and, like I said, like fantasy assets that I think they're just so gorgeous. And it might be really overwhelming to look at and be like, how do I ever get to that level? There's definitely tools out there that can help you get there a lot quicker than you might think. You don't always have to paint everything by hand. I definitely think use of stamps can help you get there, so that you can add these like cool designs and effects and like the cyber sigils and stuff without having to sit there and hand draw it all out manually. So yeah, definitely keep that in mind, and play around with some of the channels that I've linked down below to see if there's like new things that you can learn. Like one of them, the Royal Skies channel, I absolutely swear by that channel. They'll have things to teach you how to like make it look like fishnets, even though it's not actually fishnets, which again, bad for Quest users, but really good for keeping a fishnet outfit optimized and lower poly. So lots of stuff that you can do with Substance Painter. My best advice is just try not to get too overwhelmed with it. Play around with it. Watch multiple different tutorials. Don't be afraid to come back to one or multiple tutorials multiple times to be able to get everything down. But this is my workflow, and I hope that found helpful. I kind of went on a tangent. I'm so sorry, but I will definitely do my best to answer any questions. Just please bear with me if I can't answer the questions, because like I said, this is pretty much the majority of my confident knowledge in Substance Painter. There's a lot of it that I'm still trying to learn, so I might not be able to answer everything, but I will do my best to help, or at least redirect you to a channel that might be able to help. So yeah, that being said, I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you for watching my tutorial, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.